In Search of the Source, chapter 15. Who is my neighbor? Luke 10. There are 17 Philoppa villages spread out over 1,500 square miles of rugged mountainous jungle. Each of these villages is populated by about 300 people. Almost exclusively, they are perched at the top of steep ridges for defense reasons. Such positions are harder to access. Each village is considered something of a command center, dominated by its longhouse where the men live. Remember the men's house? Philoppa villages traditionally fought other Philoppa villages, though to some extent they warred with villages of other language groups as well. They also had alliances among certain villages, both Philoppa and other. All the societies in Papua New Guinea have long been webbed with well-defined lines of relationship. From infancy, everyone is taught who he is related to, what that means, in terms of gifts, future bride price, help, protection, or any other responsibility. Having a sister marry into another clan in another village will extend the relationship bonds where they might not have been before, and that could mean a meal someday, or a place to sleep, or much more. The divisions between friendly neighbors, known in the Philoppa language as Biwai, and enemies, Bowai, go back further than anyone can remember. And though a new law came to the land and put a stop to the wars and raids that would threaten villages as often as every 2 weeks, centuries-old enmities do not die easily. So basically, there are grudges that have been held for a long time. There is an airstrip down at Woposale, which makes it a place to go from time to time, to pick up some rice that's come in by plane, or some canned fish or cloth, things to stock their small trade store. To reach Woposale is a full day's walk on a rugged steep trail. But Fukutau men do not like to spend the night there. Woposale was an enemy village and the ally to which the remnant of Sete fled when Fukutau men wiped it out. Remember we talked about that, right?
No.
The men from Fukutau went and wiped out the village of Sete, because men from that city had come and killed one of theirs with the weird thing where they killed him, but then they brought his body back to life. Yeah. And then so the men from Fukutau went and basically killed half of the city of Sete, men, women, children, and the rest of them fled to Woposale. Now, if the men from Fukutau find themselves in a situation where they do have to stay overnight, they always seek housing with the pastor. Sometimes men of Fukutau will go over to Erave, maybe to sell a cassowary to those who treasure feathers. It's a 3-day trek, and to get there, they have to pass through the territories of 2 different language groups, Sambirigi and Pole. The first couple of villages they have to pass through were traditional enemies. They have some allies in the next. When they reach Erave, they don't know what they will find. Erave is a district center. It has an airstrip, a clinic, and a large trade store. Consequently, it is a gathering place for people from villages all around the area, some of whom will be old enemies. Of course, with government control there, outward trouble is generally kept to a minimum, but the threat of sorcery still looms. Visitors are left with locating allies and staying with them and doing their best to avoid contact with their enemies. When the Lord said, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy,' in Matthew 5:43, these people would have been in a hearty agreement. But when he said, 'I tell you, love your enemies,' well, that's fairly revolutionary, just as much for the Philoppa as for anybody. Once I was reprimanded for showing kindness to a pair of traditional enemies, though I didn't know it, and of course wouldn't have acted any differently if I had. Some outsiders passed through Fukutau and came to our house to ask for matches. People that live in these parts hardly ever need matches. Cooking fires burn continually in the villages. At least deep embers can always be restored. The only time a person might need matches is when he plans to spend the night in the forest. Even then, he can make a fire without a match. But with matches, it's less work. I didn't think of it at the time, but later I realized that the very fact that these men asked me for matches was their tacit acknowledgement that they would be spending the night in the forest. They knew they could not expect any hospitality in Fukutau. I gave them the matches. It was noted around the village, and later one of the old men told me that I should not have given matches to them. When I asked why not, he said that the men were from Hala. Hala was an old enemy village. This was the environment we were in when we came to translate Luke 10 and the story of the Good Samaritan. That provided a formidable passage to struggle through. Though it starts out easily enough, being a simple dialogue between an expert in the law and Jesus. Before long, we found ourselves in a morass of difficulties and confusion. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" he answered. "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this, and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Luke 10:25-29. Up to this point, we were doing fine translating the dialogue. Here, however, as Jesus started his story, I should have made it more clear that we were going into a story within a story. It can be a subtle feature, but every language has some way of signaling changes in levels of discourse, like when the subject changes or one story finishes and another begins. In English or Greek, the context will most often suffice, even though we can experience confusion. In Philoppa, however, it must be explicit, but the first time through we missed it. Translating on then. In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead." We had already gone over the fact that in other cultures, people would sometimes be robbed and not killed. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. Around these parts, roads were almost unknown, but there are paths, and though in their mind's eye, those at the table likely envisioned something quite narrow, with the priest having to make some effort to get around the robbed victim, it still worked. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. We had discussed Levites before, members of a clan with special religious distinction and function. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where that man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. Now we had to stop and talk about what a Samaritan was, a citizen of neighboring Samaria, and about the enmity that had existed between these two groups for a very long time. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Suddenly they were stuck. Suddenly we were stuck. I knew no word for wounds, and I had a difficult time getting one. I said the word is for things like sores, but they're not sores. They're like injuries, but not accidental. They were trying to grasp it. Read it again, they said. So I read it again, explaining as I went. These thieves had jumped him, I said, and he's down, and now he's lying there with these problems, these results of what was perpetrated upon him. But what's the word? What did they use on him? I don't know what they used on him. What does it matter? We have to know what they used on him, or we can't tell you the word. Why not? Because it all depends. If he was speared, we say where the spear stood. If he was shot with an arrow, we would say where the arrow stood. If he was axed, we would say where the axe stood. You tell us what they used on him, and we will tell you how to say it. Apparently, there was no generic word for wounds, and this was the best we were going to do. The only trouble was, Scripture didn't tell how it happened. In the original telling, it wasn't important. So we figured it out. Let's say it was a spear, I said. Okay, the old ones said. The ones with the most experience with this kind of thing. Did the man live? Yes, he lived, I said. Then it wasn't a spear. If it was a spear, he would most likely have died. Maybe it was an arrow, I offered. No, if it had been arrows, they would have pulled them out. Does it say anything about pulling arrows out? No. What about a dagger? No, they said. If it had been a dagger, he probably would never have recovered either. What about an axe? No way. If they had axed him, that would have been the end of him right then. Well then, maybe they just beat him up with their hands, I said. No, they protested. When you do that, the person may be covered with lumps and bumps, but there's nothing open, nothing for the Samaritan to pour medicine into. Then you tell me, I said. Well, he was lying there on the road, half dead, bleeding, but still alive. He must have been beaten with clubs. With general agreement on that, I wrote down Nopulu Deyele Tiki, where the clubs stood. We were off and moving again. I don't know that I agree with that assessment. I think that's making a lot of assumptions about the text. Then he put the man on his own donkey. He took him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you might have. Luke 10:34 and 35. That wasn't easy either. As we went on, I became aware of that old blank stare in the eyes around me. Something wasn't connecting again. I realized what it was when I needed the word for in. In this society, there's no such thing. Though hospitality for friends and clansmen is as important and as natural as having breakfast, having a place in the village set aside just for people to come out of the area to sleep was a completely foreign idea. Right? So they had no word and no concept for the word inn. If people came to visit, they stayed in the houses that were there. They didn't know how to say like hotel or anything like that. And the idea of paying for hospitality with money was worlds removed from anything they had ever thought about. But we had to move on. Without a word for inn, we just had to explain it. I wrote, a house for sleeping for a person who's on a journey where they have to pay. Not too smooth, but what can you do? So instead of coming up with a different word in their language, he just explained what it is using words in their language. When we came to the final clincher of the story and translated, which of these 3 do you think was the neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? I looked up at the men, expecting they would answer the question themselves and come up with the same one the law expert was about to. But I was wrong. Aha! Awiami Ali ventured, "The innkeeper?" When I reacted, puzzled, another said, "The expert in the law." That's when I realized we had a problem with this discourse level. We had a problem with this discourse level marker that wasn't there and needed to be. Jesus was talking about the three characters in his story: the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan. His story was a subsection of the whole discourse between Jesus and the lawyer, but it took some straightening out for the grammar for everyone to catch it. Then we translated the last verse. The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Finally, we had it. Finally, everybody in the Bible house knew who was saying what and when. What kind of wound it had been, how there was a special place to put guests, and why the Samaritan paid the innkeeper money. The hardest thing now was to follow what had been the easiest to translate, the last phrase. The question the expert in the law asked would have been the same one the folks around here would have hid behind. Maybe we all hide behind it. Who is our BY, neighbor? And who is our BOY, enemy? Jesus made it clear. Our enemy is our neighbor. Or more specifically, that one who considers us his enemy still. Our enemy is our neighbor, or more specifically, that one who considers us his enemy is still that one we are neighborly to. These are basic, yet lofty concepts, and who of us have adopted them as we should? Still, I've seen progress among the believers. They move around, even among old enemy villages, when reasons arise, showing kindness, trusting God. I remember one time when we had finished a draft of the book of Acts, and we wanted to check to see if it was clear. We trekked a long way through Philippa villages where there were no readers, and where they had heard very little of the Bible at all. Many of these were old enemy villages. Still, the men in our group showed themselves unafraid and open. They would freely share the scriptures to anyone who would gather. It would have been very natural to be jittery and leery of any sort of sorcery, yet they were brave and ready to show love to an old enemy. And that is the bete of the gospel.